Welcome to ePODstemology.
Epistemology. You know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge. What is this?
It's a Christmas special of a podcast.
EPODstemology?
Hello and welcome to another episode of ePODstemology, the podcast where we dig into some of the most exciting new developments in research in social science, philosophy, and broader intellectual realms. So if you are sick of the same tired dreck that the common public intellectuals are passing off as new insights, then this is definitely the place to come. I'm your host, Rachel Meager, and this week we have a really exciting guest, Dr. Mark Fabian. So Dr. Mark Fabian is a research associate at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge University. He was previously a Fulbright Scholar at the Brookings Institute in DC and an adjunct lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy in ANU, which is also where he earned his PhD. He will soon be commencing as a senior lecturer and the deputy director of the Institute for Social Change at the University of Tasmania. Well, actually, are you already?
January
No,
17th.
soon. Yeah. So coming very soon. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It's so great to have you. So your research, if I understand it, is really focused on human well-being at the sort of broadest possible level. And you look at both conceptual and methodological issues that focus on that. So you've got a lot of work in that area, and at a time when a lot of scholars, to some extent myself included, are defining themselves more by methodological concern, you're still primarily focused on a particular subject of inquiry as your main motivating factor.
Yeah.
So given that it's increasingly common for people in academia to split themselves off into either methodologists or kind of subject matter interests that are more philosophical, why is it important, do you think, to have those things going together?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very important, but I will concede that I think being interdisciplinary and a generalist is like an uphill battle as an academic, so I wouldn't really recommend it necessarily. But from a kind of knowledge point of view, I think it's quite important in a lot of domains to be interdisciplinary, and then in some domains where you have normative and empirical issues intertwined, to be very sensitive to the interplay of kind of methodological practices and more philosophical issues. So in the domain of well-being, well-being is a value-laden concept. It's what philosophers call a thick concept, which means that it both evaluates and describes. And because of that evaluative element, because you're making a value judgment, you're saying this is what's good for someone, this is what makes their life go well, you're going to have to get to grips with some philosophical issues there, particularly if you want to get into really edgy domains like public policy. At the same time, at least once you've defined well-being, you can certainly engage with it empirically, and so there is a scientific element. But I find that a lot of the science tends to be, if not naive, then just really trying to keep itself away from normative issues, and then that really comes back to bite it in the ass later in ways that I find not particularly helpful, and we can discuss that a bit later. Equally, though, the philosophy has long had this attitude that it's kind of insulated from science and that it can just use armchair thought experiments to make its findings relevant to the real world. And I think in a lot of recent philosophical theories of well-being, it's become quite apparent that doesn't really work. So in my personal view, like the Aristotelian conception of well-being, or so-called eudaimonia, where well-being is about living a particular way, and in the traditional Aristotelian view, that's about living rationally and virtuously, because morality and reason are the two kind of defining characteristics of the human. We've found that that's just a really poor understanding of what a human is like empirically, and so some of the more modern values-based accounts of well-being have a much more psychologically realistic and sophisticated take, and I think that makes those accounts not only just better theories of well-being, but also much more usable by people, which is something that philosophy has massively struggled with. And this idea that in well-being studies, but in science more broadly, philosophy and empirical work, or philosophy or theory and method should work together to develop concepts, is broadly called coherentism. And Cambridge has long been a kind of pioneer of coherentism, even in things like how the concept of heat emerged and thermometer technology development and stuff like that. That's a real case study in coherentism. And I think in Wellbeing, it's really taking over as the dominant paradigm, as against philosophy first or empirics first methods. On your point about interdisciplinarity, I think in Wellbeing, this is like absolutely critical. And I will hugely evangelize for this. And I think, unfortunately, there are very few genuinely interdisciplinary people. And there's a habit that I find, I should probably applaud it, but it actually pisses me off a lot, where people do a little bit of their not primary disciplines. So you'll get economists who sort of have read Daniel Kahneman and now they think that they know psychology.
Yeah.
And then you'll get some psychologists who will read maybe 2 books, or one book in philosophy that happens to be the philosophy book that aligns most closely with their own views. So you get a lot of psychologists who read Summers' work on life satisfactionism as an account of well-being, and they'll say, well, I've read the philosophy, and they won't get it at all. And you get all these stray references to Aristotle that just butcher the way he thought about stuff. And I think this is atrocious. And then so I think if I put it crudely, the need for interdisciplinarity comes in 3 ways from the disciplines that are most closely involved, I guess, in well-being research. So from philosophy, you need a sophisticated understanding of the ethical issues in well-being. From psychology, you need the reality of what it's like for the human organism to be well or to be dysfunctional. And then from economics, you need what I like to call practical adequacy, which is that a lot of our well-being theories need to be applied in certain contexts, like obviously public policy being one, things like cost-benefit analysis and should we build buses or light rail? Should we measure development in terms of GDP or in terms of self-actualisation or something like that? And a lot of well-being theories that I think are excellent well-being theories are completely inadequate practically. And so there can be some trading off there. And economics really brings, I think, a highly sophisticated and very developed view of what practice is in public policy and what form things need to take to function in that. And that's where you need the interdisciplinarity.
That makes so much sense. I found, as somebody that works at the intersection of development economics and methodology, that there is this, I think, persistent confusion that because there's many people who want to specialize in one or the other, and of course that's important. You need people who
you need deep knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what you find when you work with people who really just do, say, statistics is they would never dream of just themselves analyzing a problem that they understood nothing about. They know that the actual model that they need is embedded in the mind of the practitioner who has the subject matter knowledge. And to me, that's what's so rewarding about doing interdisciplinary work, is you're actually have that model to some extent in my brain as well. Although, because when you have interdisciplinary knowledge, you often end up with shallower knowledge, than if you just focused on one thing. That's, I think, leads a lot to collaboration, and that itself can be really rich. So I think you made the excellent point that public policy is the natural place for this concern to sort of land. And that's really exciting. And kind of to clarify that a little bit more, though you spoke to it a bit already, I was wondering if you could share what makes the concept of well-being different from the psychological or psychiatric concept of mental health. What's the distinction there, and why is this broader concern appropriate in your view? Yeah.
So the starting point would be that mental health, because of its medical history, is typically a negatively connoted thing. So it's you're unwell, and then what does it mean to be well? And we tend to think of health, maybe I'm speaking out of place because I'm not a psychiatrist or whatever, but I do get the sense from the mental health literature that the absence of mental health is kind of a neutral state. And what we're interested in well-being is super health. And the positive psychology movement actually got started explicitly because it felt that there had been an overemphasis in the history of psychology on mental ill-being, on psychopathology, and that there needed to be a systematic study of what it means to be just functioning beyond normal states. So I think well-being is broadly that within the confines of psychiatry. But if you think of well-being from a broader social science or a societal level, then you can bring in a whole lot of stuff that I think is not really about mental health. And mental health is a part of the story, but it's just kind of one variable. So one way that well-being tends to come out in the economics discourse and in the development discourse and in the ecology and society discourse, which I'm now starting to get more involved in, is that the traditional economic way of thinking about development. But I find that paradigm that phrasing to be inaccurate, because the way we think about policy is inevitably grounded in culture. So I would prefer to say like the Protestant way of doing public policy, great. Or like the 20th century way or something like that. Yeah, well, I don't know. Max Weber wrote The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and maybe it's inaccurate to think of it in Protestant terms or whatever, or British terms. But anyway, the kind of dominant cultural paradigm of the 20th century, which I think you still see in a lot of developing countries when you go there, is that, well, we're in poverty or we're in like dire circumstances. Scarcity is genuinely an issue and we need to deal with that. And when that's your kind of worldview, obviously you think about how to solve scarcity. And so you're naturally inclined towards an economic framework for thinking about development and thinking about what it means for a society to go well and for someone's life to go well. It means to be affluent and to not be constrained. And then towards the end of the 20th century, we get this shift coming out of Amartya Sen's work in particular, that income is a poor way to think about well-being. And I should pause here and like spend a bit of time on this because it's very close to my heart. And I think it's like just so badly understood. So in economics, in the late 19th century, you have this quite a rich debate between a lot of big names like Jevons and Edgeworth and things like that about what utility is in economics. So the basic behavioral models in economics all specify a utility function that determines why people choose one thing instead of another. And at this time, you had a debate about whether utility should be understood hedonically as like a mental state or a feeling that you have, usually in terms of pleasure. And that's coming out of Bentham and Mill, who were kind of economists, even if we maybe don't recognize them that way today. Versus like Jevons, who sort of thought of it as utility is just how useful something is to you. And so you should think of it as like, how much do I value this thing? And so well-being then is like getting what you value. And that's where preference satisfaction accounts of well-being come from, which is a very like well-established philosophical school of what well-being is. It's getting what you desire. And that gets really formalized in economics in the 30s because Lionel Robbins has this very influential publication where he says that we can't observe hedonic states, we can observe choice. And so we should just look at revealed preference. We should make this assumption that if someone chooses an apple over a pear at the same price, it means that they prefer an apple, they get more utility from it. And from there, you get this idea that more income means more consumption, and more consumption means more preference satisfaction. I think that's the bit that's always missed. It's like this assumption that all economics cares about is consumption. It's not true. What economics cares about is preference satisfaction. And the reason why we use income as a measure of well-being is because it's a measure of preference satisfaction. Now, in Sen's work in the late 90s, he does not move away from the preference satisfaction account. So I think this is actually also quite poorly understood, ironically, by a lot of philosophers who think Sen is talking about some kind of objective list that we need rights and we need income and we need health and stuff. And he's like, yeah, all those things are good because they allow you to satisfy more preferences. So Sen's view is that income is a bad measure of preference satisfaction because you could be, for example, rich but homosexual in a country with Sharia law, and you can't live the kind of life that brings you the most value. So what we need instead is to have a more multidimensional way of thinking about development. And so it starts with the Human Development Index. So we need education and health and income. Then it gets into the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's really great. And so coming back to your earlier question about what does well-being mean as opposed to mental health, from this societal point of view, it's like, what sort of social and economic conditions do we need for life to go well for people? And I think when you're talking about political rights and you're talking about air quality and this sort of stuff, that's not really about mental health anymore. That's about flourishing or being able to assert yourself in the world or manifest your destiny or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a huge amount of sense. And I think like just taking the mental health perspective from a psychological point of view, you miss a lot of what you get from taking a holistic kind of public policy or economics view, right? Or even a political science view, where you'd say, like, you know, maybe through extensive use of psychiatry, you could make somebody well adjusted to a horrific situation. But would that really be an ethical thing to do? But vice versa, like, you know, just thinking about people's kind of flourishing in terms of their ability to, like, exert agency in their lives is not it doesn't seem like the complete concept. And certainly, for example, like, my limited understanding of the ancient Greeks, they would have thought that's just ridiculous. Like, there's just no, like, that would be so far down the list of what would make your life good or meaningful or worthwhile that they wouldn't have associated it with flourishing at all. So sort of
let me just make a quick point on that.
Please.
So one kind of thought that I often have on this is that if your constraint is relaxed, you don't have a scarcity problem in any sense. You have abundant rights and income and health and whatever. And I think a lot of people in developed countries today are in that situation. It doesn't mean that you're well automatically, because you don't know how to necessarily spend those resources on the things that are going to bring you well-being. And so I think what we're facing in a lot of cases in developed countries today is what I would say is an information constraint. So you need to know what would be the right things for you to value for you personally. And in that case, we need a model of learning. So what is the process that people go through to learn those things? And that's probably the main thing that I study, is that process.
I think that's, like, incredibly fascinating, and that really accords with my understanding of, like, I guess, my own life and the people that I meet, especially academics, right? Like, there's so much freedom relative to other jobs even that you get. It could not be more apparent that there's, like, a massive informational constraint in how best to use the freedom that you have. Like, there's, you know, so I think that's fascinating, and I want to get into that, like, a little bit more later. But before I do that, I want to sort of ask, like, how you think the kind of well-being scholarship project is going. Like, have we made a lot of progress in the last, say, 50 years, or would you say that we're still, you know, kind of dealing with what scholars from 1,000 years ago kind of left us? And the reason I'm asking this is partially just because I want to know the answer, and partially because as an economist, I think, especially sort of a modern economist, we feel that there's perhaps some jealousy that we have about disciplines like maybe psychology, where it seems like there's kind of such a rich history of people thinking about well-being, or people thinking about their own life satisfaction. So I remember when I was in grad school, Daniel Green, who's now a professor at Harvard Business School, said that, you know, we're sort of idly sitting around, and he said that maybe, you know, in another life he would have wanted to be a psychologist, because he felt that the hedonic treadmill is just, like, such a robust fact about people, and that in economics, because the formal quantitative social science of economics is much younger, and we don't have something as comparable as that. That's how we felt in graduate school. So I'm wondering how you feel, you know, how the project's kind of going in well-being in general.
Yeah, cool. I mean, there's so much in there that I want to respond to. So the first thing I'd say is that while psychology has been thinking about, like, human existence, and philosophy has been thinking about it for a long time, I would say that the hedonic treadmill is very new. I think you see elements of it in Stoicism and in Buddhism and a lot of other kind of classical texts, but the sort of empirical result that we sort of desire things, and then when we get them, they do make us happy, but we tend to revert to a kind of baseline in short order, is quite a new empirical result, like kind of early 80s, I would say. And I also would say that I don't know if I would call the hedonic treadmill a robust fact. Like, we're sort of, like, it's one of the more robust facts, but there are a lot of measurement issues that we'll maybe get to around, particularly how life satisfaction is measured. So I think the hedonic treadmill is quite robust when you think of it from a mood point of view. So it's very rare for someone to stay in an elevated mood or a depressed mood for a sustained period, like several days. And so it does seem to be that mood is kind of homeostatically protected. You come back to some kind of baseline, and that makes evolutionary sense. You know, in evolutionary time horizons, if you were always ecstatic, you'd be like the squirrel that doesn't work through the spring or whatever, and you wouldn't prepare for the winter, and you wouldn't think about the bad future that's coming and like do stuff about it. Equally, if you were depressed all the time, you wouldn't have enough energy to go about and again prepare for the winter. So that kind of makes sense. It also makes sense that you would be primed to be slightly dissatisfied with your life, because that would like keep you working, and evolution loves to keep you working. At the same time, as I said, I'm not sure that the empirical data is as robust on this as some people might like to think, because there's big measurement errors, particularly in measuring well-being over time. But the other issue, and I think this is something that I'd like to write a paper on, and I think it's very relevant to a lot of psychology, is that the hedonic treadmill is one of these things that you can mentally train yourself to get off in various ways. So like the Buddhist way or the Stoic way is just to sort of try to stop desiring things, if I put it crudely. And that can work. And there's a lot of results in hedonic psychology around, say, reference points, where our reference points have a tendency to shift upwards as our life gets better. And you can just train yourself to not shift your reference points in that way. So during COVID, when you can't go to the gym and that's really pissing you off, you just think, well, I can't go to the gym, but at least I don't have COVID. And then you feel better. Or this has given me more time to video game, or whatever it might be. And so this is a very important concept that I think you keep making this point about everyone's methodological nowadays and everyone just wants to look at data. This point was big in classical texts. So Goethe said, maybe apocryphally, but it's definitely ascribed to him, that if you treat a person as they are, they will stay that way. I'm going to paraphrase him. But if you treat them as they can be and as they ought to be, then they will become that person. And Viktor Frankl, who was a very influential psychoanalyst in the post-war years, also was very fond of this quote, and he embedded it in a lot of his therapeutic practice. And I think it's very important for psychologists working in empirical work today to keep this in mind, because if you are transitioning from laboratory results or data analysis results to then making policy recommendations on that basis, you have to be very careful about whether you're basing your policy on the worst in humanity. So my favorite example of this is that we do know that inequality aversion, or more specifically rank aversion, is a real thing. So people, regardless of what their absolute situation is, they have $100,000. If they're surrounded by people that have $300,000, they'll feel shit. Now, that's partially because they are envious people, partially because the $300,000 people are proud people and lord it over others. Now, I think both of these are like highly toxic sentiments that aren't to anyone's well-being and aren't to society's benefit or prosperity. So if we start making policy that, we should have a more equal society because then we won't have these toxic emotions in them, I'm kind of like, that's bullshit. You've sort of like got the wrong end of the stick. What we need to do here is help people to achieve full lives that are enjoyable and meaningful and special and valuable, and not keep judging themselves about whether they're keeping up with the Joneses, because that's a shit sentiment. Okay, so that was a very like long answer to half your question.
Got it, yeah.
So steer me back towards...
So I was wondering more broadly what you think about how the project of understanding human well-being is going, and what you think kind of the central challenges maybe have been or are now in that broad project.
Oh yeah, cool. Very, very briefly before that, I just wanted to say that I think Dan is lucky that he's stuck with economics, because I think as an economist myself, I think economics actually has more fundamental insights into human nature than any other discipline, and a lot of the insights that other disciplines have are actually derived using economic tools like game theory. That
is a very hot take, which I know is why you guys all listen to our podcast. So really happy that we got that in there, and we'll definitely be tweeting that one out.
When price goes up, demand goes down, right?
Yeah, now that is something that the Romans already figured out. So actually, who's got the sort of richer intellectual history now?
Exactly.
No, so I guess thinking therefore about that broad and long intellectual history, like, if you could give us a sense of kind of your overview of how far we've come and what the central challenges have been and are now.
Yeah. So I think we know a lot more than we used to. I think we don't know anything with certainty. I think to call well-being science like a mature science would be an error. And I think a lot of the results that we currently have, a lot of the sort of stylized facts, particularly of subjective well-being, will be torched over the next 30 years. We'll see. At the same time, I think we are starting to coalesce around a lot of ideas. One thing I would say that saddens me a bit is that I do think we spent a lot of the last 30 years kind of reinventing the wheel in sort of dumb ways. So let me try to give a generous account of this. So as you said, there was this long philosophical and religious tradition of thinking about well-being, and a lot of that is great stuff. Like, I'm particularly fond of the Stoics. I think a lot of, say, sort of existentialism, which runs from like 1880 to 1950 or thereabouts, is gangbuster stuff, and everyone should get into it, and maybe I'll talk about it a bit later. I think a lot of early psychoanalysis, Freud, Jung, Frankl, Adler, and then particularly the American self-actualization humanists like Maslow and Rogers, cracking, like such good stuff. And then for whatever reason, well, I know the reason, we just forgot all of that. And I think the reason why we forgot all of that is because it was not quantitative. There's a book by Will Davies called The Happiness Industry, which is a classic sort of Will Davies polemic. He's probably my favorite left-wing ideologue. He's a sociologist at Goldsmiths, very consistently left-wing, but consistently fresh takes from a left-wing perspective. And I think he's very much worth reading for that angle. And The Happiness Industry is kind of like this standard Will Davies stuff. Like, you got to just take the polemic on, enjoy it. One of the things in that book that's really cool is that he does a kind of a brief history of sort of how American psychology got started, and that a lot of American psychologists in the post-war years visited these, at that time, the legacy of Freud's school and Jung's school and all this kind of stuff, the German and Swiss and Austrian psychoanalytic schools, and were just kind of shocked by what they found there. They complained a lot about how they'd spent all day talking about metaphysics, and they were here to do psychology. And when they went back to America, a lot of them went into organizational psychology, marketing, and these kind of things that I think today we do much more closely associate with the American approach to psychology. And that approach really required empiricism. And I think that's also the time of logical positivism's ascendancy. And so you have this much stronger emphasis on quantification and positive and like falsification and all that sort of stuff. And so a lot of the great work that Rogers is doing, painstakingly piecing together a theory of therapy from casework, just gets lost. And I think we're now rediscovering that work slightly because we've spent 30 years doing good empirical work that should be commended, but finding results that I'd like to think are kind of a bit obvious, like rediscovering the insights of Stoicism and that sort of stuff. And now we're starting to move on to this deeper substratum of stuff around meaning in life and self-actualization and dealing with existential problems, and like, what's the role of morality in well-being, and why does morality depend on other people, and some of these things that then you just can't really approach these questions quantitatively, or it's like exquisitely difficult. And so people are rediscovering the need for sort of more qualitative methods and that sort of stuff. I'll probably talk later about all the cool shit that we know, but I think we know a lot of good stuff. Yeah.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear,
Yeah.
and that's really interesting. Like, I think that a lot of what you've talked about there, like, is stuff that, you broadly hear about in non-academic settings. And now there has been more of this kind of, I think it's also true in economics, especially in microeconomics, that there was this push to, like, let's try to quantify everything. And, quantified social science has a particular set of rules. But the rules were actually developed for agricultural science.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, regression.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they're actually, I think, in fact, a deeper study of quantification itself and statistics as a discipline, like the role of the question that you're actually asking is absolutely central to that discipline.
Yeah.
And so it's just not tenable to think that you're going to get away with not thinking deeply about the question you're asking when you're trying to study anything quantitatively, let alone like human well-being. And actually, so from my own work, like part of what's been challenging for me that I'm wondering how that manifests in the well-being kind of scholarship space is that we have an intellectual history, not just in economics, but in other disciplines, of overemphasizing homogeneity or similarity because it's easier to quantify the average of something than to understand the distribution of something. And, you know, obviously parsimony is good, and you can't, like, the map's not the territory and you can't hold everything in your head. But there's real areas in certainly development economics, for example, where, you know, the heterogeneity is the main story. Like the dominant feature of the data is that it's very varied. That's the much more important than its location or whatever. So I was wondering, like, what the role, like, of kind of how central is that understanding of heterogeneity versus homogeneity and what people value, what contributes to individual well-being. And does that kind of come through in well-being studies? How do they grapple with heterogeneity and what makes people flourish?
Yeah, great stuff. There's a quote by Jung that I quite like where he says something like, you can take a bag of pebbles and measure the sort of weight and take an average. You'll know what the average pebble is in terms of its dimensions and its weight and things like that. No pebble in that bag will be like that. And this is sort of from the early days of the psychological study of well-being. How does psychology deal with it? Like, I guess badly in some ways, because we do just look at means and that sort of thing. There's a push on right now in life satisfaction research to look at the tails of the distribution more, because we've noticed that overwhelmingly people in developed countries just say they're 7 or 8 out of 10. That seems to be largely driven by stable personality traits around whether you're just like prone to positive reporting or negative reporting. And so it's not very interesting. Like, we don't learn a lot by looking at people at that range, and it might just be noise. So it's much more interesting actually to look at people who are under 5, because something has disastrously gone wrong if you're reporting less than 5 because of that homeostatic stuff that I mentioned earlier. And so we just seem to get kind of fatter insights at the moment, or there's more marginal value in that sort of work. So there's some heterogeneity creeping in that way, and I have some colleagues at Oxford who work on looking not just at growth but also at recessions and the kind of differential effects of those things. So there is a bit of curiosity now to move into heterogeneity. I should say that, like, you know, the field's very young, the empirical side of the field, and so it's fine for them to establish a sort of core baseline of average effects for average people, and then move from there to interesting deviations. On the theory side, so moving away from empirics, I think the theory starts with much more of an acknowledgement of heterogeneity, that everyone is a bit different, particularly if you're looking at theories that embrace the subjectivity of well-being, or embrace the fact that it is heterogeneous. Like, well-being means different things to each person. So the theories that I'm particularly fond of tend to try to create a generalized way of expressing that, and try to find some broad framework that can be manifested in a unique way. So a very simple example would be something like Valerie Tiberius and Jason Rabley have a theory that I guess I'm also a proponent of, that's like well-being is about value fulfillment or something like that. That it's similar to the preference satisfaction account, except much more explicitly like what you value, not in a normative sort of ethical sense. And so there's a lot more kind of caveats around what sort of values are appropriate values. You can't just be valuing whatever. The theory of well-being as value fulfillment is a general theory that can apply to everyone, but obviously each person is going to fulfill different values. And then again, when you're thinking about what's an appropriate value to a person, in Valerie's work, she says that appropriate values integrate emotions, motivations, and cognitions. And I've just had a paper accepted where I kind of embellish her more philosophically oriented work with a lot of the psych literature that I think provides the process by which that occurs, and just kind of provides way more texture to what she's saying. And so there again, you have a situation where, you know, when I'm playing tennis, I really enjoy tennis, and so I get a lot of good emotional feedback, and I find it very easy to I used to find it very easy to motivate myself to play tennis, and then I could reflect on why. And I'd say what I actually kind of like the repetitive element of drilling, because I feel like I'm just slowly getting better and better at stuff. I like how precise this game is. Before I became too good at kind of relatively advanced at tennis and realized that it's actually incredibly tactically shallow. I thought it had a lot of tactical depth, and that was really interesting.
So we got another hot take here, this time from the anti-tennis corner.
Well, I'm very pro-tennis. I mean, I used to coach tennis, but yeah, tennis is a very shallow sport, and they've made it more shallow over the last 30 years. But we don't need to
go into that. I'm afraid that may not tolerate. They're very open-minded. But I think they may not tolerate this.
So like another person playing tennis would have a completely different experience of that in terms of emotions, motivations, and their introspection on those signals that they get. And so I think the theory, while general, allows for heterogeneity in it, whereas some other theories that I don't like tend to be much more constrained in terms of what's okay. So the Aristotelian tradition, which is in many ways closely aligned with the Catholic tradition through the Thomist vein, tends to say that there are some like objective goods that human activity must be oriented towards in order for that life to be going well. So you have to be living virtuously, but the virtues are not defined by the individual. They are, in fact, moral facts. And I think that doesn't work for me at all, because I don't think it's psychologically realistic.
Got it. So just to dig in a little bit more to that, so would, I guess, proponents or scholars that focus on a more values-driven notion of well-being for people, would that be something that's sort of emphasized to the exclusion of saying, look, there's like basic things that everybody needs to flourish, and there is like a set of universal human needs or whatever, that goes beyond like the physical functioning of the organism? Or would it be like, well, there's some of this is accounted for by like, there's like a handful of human universals, or there's like a handful of tendencies that it's meaningful to say basically everyone is like this or wants this. Or is there really not? Is there really, it's really just, there's a lot of different values a person can have, and they prioritize them differently. And that's kind of the main core of what well-being might be in that framework.
Yeah, no, definitely some sense of kind of basic needs. So a couple of ways to think about this. So in the philosophical literature, there's this very strong distinction made between what's intrinsic to well-being, so what is actually well-being, and what is merely instrumental to it. And I think a lot of those theories would say that like health and income and these resources like bodily functioning and whatever is instrumental to well-being. You can't get well-being unless you have those things, but they are themselves not well-being. There is a view, some objectivist theories of well-being would say that they are in fact the thing itself, but that's usually not how they think about it. So that's how philosophy deals with all of that. In psychology, so I get a bit annoyed where everyone's talking about Maslow all the time. Like, I love Maslow, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been superseded. And I think one of the much more prominent takes nowadays is the view of self-determination theory, which is that humans have 3 basic psychological needs that are universal. And I'm quite compelled by the cross-cultural work on this. I know that it's fairly controversial. Like, some people have said that the cross-cultural work has been misinterpreted. The self-determination people fired back to say that their interlocutors just have an axe to grind and won't accept that it's actually cross-cultural. But anyway, so 3 basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And I'll explain those in a second, but a key point is that if your basic psychological needs are met, then barring an adverse environment, so barring climate change or a volcanic explosion or whatever, your physical needs will also be met. So a human organism with basic psychological needs met will be able to function in the world and solve its basic biological needs, like food and shelter and sex or whatever. So the basic psychological needs, autonomy is the preeminent one in some ways, which is just to be volitional in your life, so not be doing what other people tell you to do, because then likely they'll use you for their own ends, not for your ends. Competence, which is to feel skillful at whatever it is that you feel the need to be skillful at. So if your parents are grinding you to play the piano when you really just want to play FIFA, and you keep telling them that they're the same skill set, it's all finger coordination, then that can undermine your sense of competence, because you're like, I don't need to learn piano because piano doesn't benefit me in any way. Your parents might think they know better or whatever, but you know yourself better. Anyway, and then relatedness is your sense of belonging, your sense of feeling loved and cared for, and is the most complex, and that's where a lot of the cross-cultural stuff comes in. So, like, for example, in one study they found that it's actually from an autonomy point of view, but it has a nice link to relatedness, that American youth, kind of 18 to 30, felt more autonomous when they made decisions having consulted with people they respected and trusted. Japanese youth felt more autonomous when they effectively took advice from someone that they trusted and respected. But in neither of these cases are they forced to do something. So both groups felt really bad, very unautonomous and unwell when they were coerced, in a sense, where they felt very boxed in and constrained. And I think anyone who pays much attention to Japanese anthropology will know that that's like a omnipresent feeling in Japan. So there is a bunch of other studies out of Bangladesh and other places that are very kind of communal or collectivist that I think affirm this notion that the way we think about autonomy manifests slightly differently in more collectivist cultures, but autonomy is still present in various guises in all of them. And collectivism is, the need for relatedness and belonging is also very present in individualistic cultures. It's just slightly different in its psychological forms.
That makes a lot of sense. That's super interesting. So you said that there's a sort of misconception that, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is still kind of the cutting edge when in fact it's been superseded. But you've actually worked on self-actualization.
I have, yeah.
Which, in the sort of broader, certainly in the sort of layman's understanding, I think he's the father of self-actualization as a concept. So I was wondering if you could tell us, I guess, a little bit about like what self-actualization actually is, how it's different from, say, values fulfillment, in itself. And also if you could tell us about your work on the like actual practical enactment of self-actualization. Because I think, it's nice to think about these things as a concept, but how would a person actually become self-actualized? It's very, very open. Yeah.
Okay. So I think well-being as value fulfillment is a theory of what well-being is intrinsically. And I think that's actually a very low marginal value question. So I have a book coming out next year, and one of my arguments is that we should stop worrying about this intrinsic instrumental distinction, because if you take one step back to how you get whatever you decide intrinsic well-being is, then you discover that actually everything's tangled up together. And so we need to understand all of these things together. And I would basically think of self-actualization. You could, if I was being generous to, say, Tiberius and stuff, I would say that self-actualization is the process by which we achieve the fulfillment of appropriate values. That's one way to think about it. Maybe you could just say they're like the same thing, so that they're very hand in hand. But another way to think of it is, I think of self-actualization as a process broadly that fulfills all sorts of different accounts of well-being. And one of them happens to be well-being as value fulfillment. I'm quite fond of well-being as value fulfillment, so I'm happy that they're so compatible, but I'm not hugely invested in that. So self-actualization, how would I describe it? It's how you. So there's two Hellenic maxims from the classical Greeks: know thyself and become who you are, and that's what self-actualization is about. A view of self-actualization that I don't like, or that I think is like empirically false, is the view of David Norton, who wrote an excellent book called Personal Destinies, which is a philosophical book, where he argues that self-actualization is essentially a process of self-discovery. So you have to look inwards, find your daemon, which is your like inner true self, and then kind of manifest it in the world. And I think that's not quite right. So we just don't have that much of an innate self. There is some innate self. Certainly you have dispositions, like my tennis example earlier, or you with statistics and economics and whatever. Certainly we have some intrinsic motivations, which are things that we just find we spontaneously want to do. We don't even find ourselves valuing them and then doing them. We just like jump into it, just want to do it. We have talents, like if you're short, you're going to have a hard time playing basketball, that sort of thing. And, you know, kids have personalities and they tend to, so there's some kind of innate self, but there's nowhere near enough in there for that to constitute a fully fledged identity. So there is an element of self-discovery, but also an element of self-creation. And certainly in the developmental psychology literature, and shout out to David Norton, for a philosopher writing in the 70s, he read a lot of Piaget and he really tried to do the psychology. So I think he was an early torchbearer for the good way of doing this scholarship, but you know, again, the science has moved on a bit, and one of the defining features of sort of adolescence is an awareness of conflicting aspects of the self. So you have different values going on and things that you kind of care about, and they just don't work together. And so this is really nice turn of phrase in Norton's work where he says that adolescents kind of experiment with all sorts of things very furiously, and that's why they change their wardrobes so fast and all that kind of stuff until they start to settle into some grooves that more work for them. And I think for me, I was like, David, why didn't the penny drop for you here? Like, if you're experimenting with a lot of stuff, then it's not just discovery, there must be a creation element, or after that, you then deepen whatever identity you discover. So the process then by which self-actualization occurs, by which we kind of step into ourselves, which I think is the core theme in Jung's psychoanalysis, so the process of individuation, and also core to Carl Rogers' philosophy, and both of them basically thought that psychopathology, when it is not chemical, but they thought that a lot of things that seem predominantly chemical, like schizophrenia, can often actually be a more psychological thing. There's some event, typically a trauma, that interrupts this process of individuation, and the process of therapy is to find that trauma that's acting as a kind of pin that's blocking this flow and take it out so that the process can get going again. So I've worked up a model of this process. It's a combination of self-determination theory, which I mentioned earlier, and self-discrepancy theory and a bunch of other stuff. But if I put it in simple terms, you have to harmonize who you want to be, who you ought to be, and who you are at the moment. Now, who you are includes a lot of things, your intrinsic motivations and qualities that you hate about yourself and can't get rid of or can get rid of or whatever. Your ideal self is a sort of high-level goal, and a bunch of other goals are nested within that. So like if I want to be an astronaut, but it doesn't need to be ambitious. I just use ambitious ones that are easy to think about in process terms. So I want to be an astronaut, but it could be something much more mundane. When I be an astronaut, then I'm going to need to be fit. I'm going to need to learn astrochemistry or whatever. So I'm going to go take some classes in that, and I'm going to go to gymnastics. And so you set about affirming this identity. So you think, that's what I want to be. What are the behaviors associated with that? What are the values associated with that? And then you start to make your life more in line with those values. Now, the ought self is the same thing. It's a value system that you feel some responsibility to be. But the key thing with the ought self is that these values are fundamentally ethical. They have some moral quality to them. And these the ideal and the ought self goals can be in conflict. And so we have to harmonize both within them, which I'll get to in a second, and across them. So maybe you want to be an astronaut, but you also want to be a really present mother or something like that. And that's going to be hard to reconcile, right? So maybe you eventually instead you work in the lab, or you work in Houston. We have Houston ground control, something like that, right? Okay, so just sticking with the ideal self, because the ought self, I'd have to start talking about nihilism and stuff for another conversation. So the ideal self, like I want to be an astronaut, so I do gymnastics and I do physics classes, and then I go and do things. That's the start. You try to affirm this identity, step one. Then you get feedback. You get affective feedback, so emotional feedback and emotional information, and you get social feedback. So maybe you go to your physics class and it's really fascinating. You're just like super into it, right? So you get good emotional feedback and the motivation is really easy. So that seems really good. You go to gymnastics, you're not feeling it. And then you got to introspect on these signals, right? So you notice that just everything's going great in physics. So you're like, all right, well, maybe I'm going to do more of that. So I'm going to pick up more courses or something. I'll go to night school. At gymnastics, you're introspecting and you're thinking, well, actually, the main feedback that I'm getting is that everyone here is kind of mean to me. So this is like social feedback. So are people telling me that gymnastics is really not for me? I just don't fit in? Or are these people just bitches and I need to go somewhere else, right?
Yeah, no, we've all had that moment
Yeah.
where you're asking, like, do I not belong in this community?
Yeah.
Or is this just, like, the worst gymnastics club
Yeah.
in the Fort Worth area?
Yeah.
And I should just look for a different gymnastics club.
Yeah, that's right. So then you're going to go, okay, maybe it's gymnastics that's the problem. Maybe it's this gymnastics club that's the problem. So if it's a club, I'm going to change clubs. If it's a sport, I'm going to change sports. If it's athletics, then maybe astronaut isn't my jam, but I'm really enjoying these physics classes. So maybe I just should be a land-based researcher because I like that shit, and the astronauts can send me data and I'll work on it. So you see here that your emotions, your motivations, and your cognitions, your introspection or your reflection on those emotions and motivations over time become calibrated such that they're integrated, so they all kind of work together. Your life fits together in a sort of coherent way. And then we can add more to it. So you will like the kind of life that you have because it is in fact the life you thought was ideal. You valued that life and you thought it was ethically good too. So in terms of meaning in life, if you're pursuing the ought self in some way, then you're doing what you think you have a responsibility to do, but you're probably also making the world more the way you want it to be, which is going to make you feel ethically good. Maybe you're going to engage in a lot of moral contestation with other people. So that's something that I have work on, but is probably outside the scope of this conversation. And then, in terms of your moods, you're broadly going to be in positive moods most of the time because you do the things that you like. You're broadly going to have easy motivation because you do things that you disengage from things for which motivation is difficult. You'll stick with some because of the ought self aspects, but typically we move towards things that are easy. And then you'll generally be satisfied with your life. You will generally have flow, which I think is a really underappreciated note. Like it's highly appreciated in psychology, but kind of for the wrong reasons. Like people sort of study it for the hedonic experience. And when I talk to philosophers about my views on flow, they're always like, but flow, I mean, it's just a hedonic experience. I'm like, no, that's the easiest way to access it. So a lot of the studies of it are with piano virtuosos while they're playing and they get ecstatic or whatever. But actually in Csikszentmihalyi's original formulation, he had a much grander vision of what flow is. So flow is the feeling of being lost in the moment or in the zone. And, a lot of athletes talk about that and that sort of thing. When you're really engrossed in an activity, you kind of lose sense of time and you're not feeling anything. That was kind of the key point of it. He's like, it's not happiness, because when a surgeon is operating or a rock climber is climbing, they can't stop and appreciate how happy they are, because then the rock climber will fall to the bottom of the mountain. Yeah. You're just like in it, and then you get to the top and you're like, wow, that was so like exhilarating. And his view is that you could transform your entire life into a kind of a generalized flow experience. And I think the way you do this is through this self-actualization process. So the conditions for flow are high quality immediate feedback, intrinsic motivation, I'm forgetting the other ones. Anyway, the self-actualization process means that all the criteria for flow are met across most of the activities with which you occupy yourself. Yeah. There's always going to be some activities that are imminent, as de Beauvoir would say, which is just activities that you do to sustain life, like doing the dishes and taking a shower and stuff.
Yeah, writing grant reports.
Yes, writing grant reports. So de Beauvoir had this distinction between imminent things, which just keep your life going, and transcendental activities, which sort of bring it meaning and value and stuff. And so flow is where many of the things in your life are transcendental, and you have a real kind of rational and emotional grasp of why they are transcendental for you. And I think that's where well-being happens.
That makes sense. Like, I think, there's like a lot of what you're talking about here. There's like this fundamental notion of alignment. Like you just slowly kind of bringing everything into alignment, and then you have that experience. Like it's kind of baked in the name. Like things have to be aligned in order for things to flow kind of naturally. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. So that's really interesting. And I think, studying or from a holistic perspective, like how is that produced? But obviously, like what you're describing is a process that, some people naturally do this. Other people learn how to do it from people around them or in therapy or from life coaches. And some people never learn how to do this. Right. Yeah. And so the problem is, like, if we go back to, the sort of quantitative understanding of happiness, or we think about like trying to have a more hands-off, theoretical, quote-unquote, approach to happiness. It seems like when you come from that quarter, you hear this idea that you should just ask people what makes them happy, and then we're going to understand happiness.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really seem to jive exactly with like a lot of what we've talked about. So I was wondering if you could share with us, like, what you think of that, of the sort of component of just like asking people how happy they are, what makes them happy, and where you think we are on that methodologically, and where you'd like to see that go, or what you think the role of that is.
So I've got to start with a point of clarification. So what we do in a lot of research is ask people how happy they are. It's extremely rare that we ask them why. And I actually am doing work right now where I ask people why. And I think, so like we might ask someone like, how satisfied are you with their life on a scale from 1 to 10? It's a very common question. We might ask them questions like, how happy, would you say that you experienced a lot of happiness yesterday, or a lot of sadness, or a lot of joy, or a lot of boredom, various emotional states? And we just treat those as binary variables, like 0 or 1. That's called the day reconstruction method. So we get people to reflect on the last 24 hours. I think that methodology is that the day reconstruction methodology and what's called experience sampling, where you kind of pager people or you hit them on their smartphones to say, how are you feeling right now? And they like choose a mood state, is pretty good. And I think our understanding of mood is, to my mind, much more robust than our understanding of satisfaction. I don't think there's really been any research since Gallup, who came up with the life satisfaction scale in like the 50s or something, as to why people are satisfied with their life. The reason for that is because it's a very reasonable reason, which is a lot of the researchers in this space are worried that people have various cognitive biases that mean that they don't report that second question well. So famously, there's a focusing illusion study where they asked people in the Midwest of America whether they'd be happier in California. Overwhelmingly, they said they would. They'd have higher life satisfaction. But then if you look in the raw data, you see that the average satisfaction in the Midwest is basically identical to the average satisfaction in California. And Kahneman and colleagues were like, well, this must be because people in the Midwest overestimate certain good things about California, like the weather, and don't appreciate certain bad things like the cost of real estate or something like that. That's possible. The other possible is just that the scale that people in the Midwest are using is qualitatively different in meaning from the scale that people in California are using. And I think this issue of scale differences is like grossly underexplored. They were really acknowledging it strongly in the late 90s. There was a very prominent book by Kahneman, Ed Dana, and Norbert Schwartz, I think, called Wellbeing, The Foundations of Hedonic Psychology, which was a very good volume, although I think a little ambitious in its title. And in that book, they're very upfront about a lot of the sort of measurement problems they have. There's a chapter by Frederick and Lowenstein talking about how the hedonic treadmill might just be an artifact of measurement instruments and things like that. And then for some reason, in the next 20 years, like no one touched this problem. And then a generation changed, and the current generation often seems to think that these scales have just been validated and they're heaps used and everything's fine and we can just run some regressions. And I think that's super dangerous. And a lot of my work is on how life satisfaction scales may be cooked. I'm pretty convinced that they are, but I'm in some adversarial collaborations now which is the best way to do science, where we're going to test our theories. But I think that given the state of knowledge about what goes on when people report their life satisfaction, we should have at least a couple of studies where we just sit with people in a really long way as they answer those questions. So what we're doing is we ask people, what's your life satisfaction? And then when we say, while you're answering this question, please think out loud. So one question they were interested in is whether people give a very quick heuristic response. So famously, people answer these questions in less than 7 seconds, typically.
Whoa.
Which is really fast.
I would not answer that question. You have to give me like 10 minutes to answer that question.
And there is a fat-tailed distribution, as you can imagine.
All academics and
people. And then there's interesting questions about whether that fat tail correlates with people who have had therapy or have had breakdowns in their life or whatever. or for whatever reason are just a bit more thoughtful about it. But it does seem to be that a lot of people just give a very emotion-driven response. So they quickly consult their emotions as a heuristic, and that colours their response. And we also have corroborating evidence for that, because manipulating people's emotions around life satisfaction scale questions, like by asking about politics beforehand or having them find $1 or something like that, results in quite large changes in their responses. So it does seem to be heavily coloured by emotional state. But in our study, we also have a bunch of follow-up questions. So we ask them directly, like, did you think about that, or did you just kind of check with your emotions and make a decision? And then we also want to know things like, did you just think about your own situation, or did you also think about your family and how society's going? Did you just think about like right now, or the past week, or the past year? And then I also we have a whole bunch of questions that I don't want to get too technical on, but one thing that we do want to ask is questions of the sort like, okay, so you said 7 out of 10, like what kind of life would you need to be living to give an 8 out of 10? And then they think about it and they give you the answer, and then you ask them like, did you think about that sort of stuff when you were answering the question? And then we also try to get them to reflect a bit on what they would have said last year, what they would have said next year. But I think that those sort of questions are pretty pie in the sky. People are very bad at remembering their well-being, very bad at prospecting their well-being in terms of their numbers. So we actually have some longitudinal studies that we're hopefully about to get funding for, where we get people to describe their scales in words. Like we give them a tweet per point where we say like, yeah, what kind of life would you need to be living for blah? And then we can show them that scale a year later. And we say, this is what you said last year. On this scale, what is your life satisfaction today? And on the scale that you just described for me as your scale today, what was your life satisfaction a year ago? And in that way, we can sort of check whether these scales are consistently mean the same thing over time.
Wow, that's so. When you have that sort of persistent difficulty in people like recalling, so at that point, in the absence of you doing that kind of intervention or exercise with them, like they would have a specific protocol where, and people seem to have biases in their recollection of how happy they were. And actually, I'm not sure kind of, if you go in and change that, like, if, for example, people are constantly overestimating how happy they were in the past, there's a sense in which, you're probably dampening their mood if you inform them of that. So on the one hand, it's like, what's their real, but on the other hand, you're giving them more information, or you're focusing their attention towards other things that are true in their own psychology and in their lives. So is there like a general discussion in this literature or this field about like, whether well-being or happiness even, or mood I guess mood is defined in the moment, but well-being, to what extent are we thinking about over someone's life? Or like, if I was miserable when I was doing something, but now I recall it as positive, was that good or bad?
Yes, there is. In the philosophy literature, it's mostly a kind of analytical question about whether we should assess well-being in a moment-by-moment, sort of by taking integral in a sense, or whether we should have a kind of whole-of-life perspective or something like that. I don't think that actually has an answer. Certainly if you take this self-actualization view that I mentioned earlier, because you have to kind of do calibration, and a lot of your bad decisions end up being good in a sense because they improve your knowledge. Well-being is just messy, and there's no way to do either moment by moment or whole of life. That's just not suitable. So where for practical reasons we need one or the other, then we can make considerations given the context. But I think just in the broad sense, that question just doesn't have an answer. On this idea that people might, in hindsight, say that situation was actually not as good as I thought it was. For example, this is sometimes called the problem of adaptive preferences, or false consciousness, or consciousness raising, and it's I think very prominent in the wellbeing space, and it does seem to be one of the dividing lines, if I'm being uncharitable, between people that work with communities in poverty or other forms of oppression, and people that come out of like pretty bougie establishments. So people who've had good lives, bougie establishments, tend to kind of not take this that seriously, and they sort of see that, well, we can just trust people's responses. And there's a good aspect to that, like you're respecting their agency and things. At the same time, like I've worked recently with people who've had experiences of homelessness and that sort of thing and domestic violence, and I had someone literally say to my face, like, oh yeah, when I was in this like fully abusive marriage, I would have said that my life's going pretty well because I was doing all the things that my culture expects me to do. I was married, I had kids, I was taking care of the household, whatever. And then working as a social worker, a lot of my colleagues raised my consciousness of how my marriage was abusive. And then once that sort of dropped to me, I realized that my life was cooked and I needed to massively rearrange it. And there was a really kind of rough period there where things were very touch and go financially and all this kind of stuff. And now I'm out the other side and I feel much better. And now and this was a kid, and now I feel I have autonomy in my life and freedom and stuff. And I feel much better about it. And I can see that my life back then was shit. And I think when people say that to you in such a kind of, if you're respecting people's agency, you've got to respect those kind of reports. So I think there is a strong literature on that in development studies, and similar kind of spaces, and certainly in psychotherapy. But I don't think that's really penetrated the happiness economics discourse as much as I'd like. But I guess they're taking it more seriously. And I think this does come back to that point that I made earlier about treating people as they are or treating them as they can be, that if we find that after asking people about their life satisfaction and then discussing their response with them for half an hour, they change their number. And I have this built into our current research methods. At the end, we say, well, on the basis of our last 30 minutes of discussion, do you actually want to change the number that you gave? If we find that a lot of people say yes, then I think this raises like serious ethical questions. Like which one of these people do we trust? The person that gave us their quick heuristic response, or the person who gave the measured kind of reflective response at the end?
Yeah, I think it's really unclear, and it seems like that kind of research is going to open up a lot of kind of new questions. I think related to this, I was wondering about the role, and this goes back to some of the Stoic stuff we're talking about, but I think there's a methodological issue, the role of expectation in people's happiness. Yeah. You hear this is a bit of a talking point in the culture, especially because this is a constant kind of generational complaint that people have about people's expectations changing, but that clearly is going to feed into research about well-being and research about happiness. Not that those are the same thing, but obviously related. But people's expectations of how they should be treated, for example, if you might be happy in an abusive marriage if you expect to be abused. If you believe that that's what life is, then there's no reason to be unhappy. It's just like, or it rains sometimes. Like, there's no reason to be unhappy about that. If that's how you view being abused by the people around you, then you won't be unhappy about it. But when you discover that actually it's possible to live without being abused by the people around you, that absolutely changes your understanding of how happy you are, because it changes the denominator of how happy you think you could be. But how, is there any grappling with that in like the measurement of people's well-being or happiness at the moment, or
Yeah, definitely. I mean, expectations is a big part of the literature. I guess I'm a little bit underwhelmed by the level of sophistication with which they treat it. So often the conclusion is to just kind of set low expectations. I feel like that's the punchline of a lot of Alain de Botton's kind of pop philosophy, and there was a book recently called Soul for Happiness or something like that, and that was also the punchline there, just like have low expectations essentially. And I don't think that's right. You should have expectations that are like well calibrated to yourself. Expectations about the future is a hard thing to deal with. Like if I expect to get a tenure track position or something, that's a pretty wild expectation. Like a lot of that is not within my control, things like that. So that it's hard to give good advice on what your attitude should be to that kind of stuff. But in terms of, it's not a good idea to just set low standards for yourself, knowing that you'll meet them and then you'll be happy. Because what you will find is that you are bored. Yeah. So you should set standards that are appropriate for yourself. Maybe you really do genuinely prefer a slightly relatively more mundane life. then set those standards and go for it. You have a great time. But if you are like capable of winning an Olympic gold medal, and genuinely that's kind of what you want to do, and you kind of train hard for it and everything, and then someone comes along and says, bro, don't set these high expectations. Just try to, like, I don't know, get a college scholarship or something. Then you'll get your college scholarship. You'll be bored as shit in NCAA athletics or whatever, because you should be competing in the Olympics and like having a red hot go at it. And so I think you should calibrate it on that basis. And as you get closer to your limits, your potential, or closer to, not your limits because that's in the athletic context, closer to this ideal life that you're kind of iterating towards, then you'll get a better sense for where you want to stop or where you want to push it. And I think for high performing people, and I don't think that that's the way that most people should live, but some people are wired for high performance. It's very painful to find your limit and discover that it's not very high. And I should think more about what advice to give those kind of people. But I think you have to, my main advice would be that you have to respect when you've put effort consistently in one direction. That's not something that most people can do. And reaching your limit is something that exquisitely few people do. So even if your limit happens to be quite low, if you hit it, that's like legendary stuff. You should celebrate yourself.
That's a victory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of expectations, I guess that would be my broad point. I think in terms of probabilistic expectations, there's too much other stuff that you need to be cognizant of there around probability theory and whether you have good habits of mind around prediction.
Got it. Yeah, that's challenging. So I want to sort of ease into kind of wrapping up with two sort of somewhat more topical questions. Okay. Just in case we didn't have enough hot takes. So we're going to talk about like women, and we're going to talk about COVID.
Okay.
So sometimes you hear in debates about feminism or like what direction we think social movements for like liberation from patriarchy should be taking, that there's some evidence that suggests that maybe in these life satisfaction surveys or whatever, women on average in countries like the United States are no happier than they were in 1950, before a lot of the legal project really got going, and in fact that maybe they're less happy. So I was wondering if you've got kind of any quick comment on that, or like what should we, if we knew stuff about well-being, what would we think about that?
So I guess I think that this literature is heavily plagued by measurement issues, and so it's unclear what's going on. And unfortunately, I will not be convinced by any paper that claims to show what's going on unless it also shows me something about the measurement. So there is a study, for example, it was Mallory Montgomery's job market paper in, I think, 2017, but she then didn't go into academic work, and so it never got published, which is like a tragedy, where she used vignettes to anchor people's life satisfaction responses to a common standard, and found that once you do that, the standardly observed slightly higher life satisfaction response of women relative to men converged. It didn't converge all the way, but there was a substantial correction, like 0.2 on a 1 to 10 scale, which if you do life satisfaction research, you know that that's actually quite a colossal result. That's like a big effect.
That's a big move, yeah.
Yeah. So I think some of this might just be differences in scale use between men and women. I wouldn't be surprised if women in the 50s use scales quite differently to women today. So it's not just that there are gender differences, there are also cohort effects. At the same time, if I stay away from measurement issues, then there are well-established results around or stylized facts around expectations. So one is that there seems to be a U-shaped relationship between age and life satisfaction, that actually people seem to be most miserable at around the age of 45. A pop book on this is The Happiness Curve by John Rauch, which is quite good. It's very entertaining. And he takes more of a kind of like journalistic approach to it, which I think is actually more honest than a purely scientific take. I'm going to get some very big names offside by saying that I think the U-shaped curve is probably an artifact. So again, I think it's a cohort effect, but there is a very powerful study. So Andrew Oswald's probably the most prominently associated academic with the U-shaped curve. I don't really buy Like, I think it's a very consistent effect, and there's probably something to it, but I don't think it's as much of a curve as they say. It's pretty flat. Anytime we do studies that correct for scale use changes, it's one of the first results to get hammered. But he did a study, or he collaborated with some primatologists and looked at the frequency with which monkeys smile over their life course. And they did find, even in terms of monkey smiles, that midlife is the shittest period. And one theory for why midlife is rubbish is because you have to confront the fact that you have not lived up to your desires or expectations or ideals or whatever in midlife. So by the time you get to 45, 50, you realize that you're not going to be a professor at Harvard. You're not going to be Roger Federer. You're not going to, live in Beverly Hills, all these kind of things, right? Your kids are not geniuses, blah, blah. And you just got to deal with that. You got to sit with it. Then there's also some kind of more psychobiological explanations, and John does quite a nice job of this in the happiness curve, that like the midlife crisis kicks in. Like, he sort of talks about the midlife crisis. The midlife crisis is a bit kind of controversial. Like, a lot of psychologists think it doesn't exist. It's just kind of like an urban myth. But there's this idea that your brain, particularly for men, I guess, I would assume, just kind of comes back and says, like, bro, like, time to have like more babies, like get back out there, get on it. So there's this kind of flurry of existential anxiety there that comes on quite strong, and that makes people feel crap even if they have actually done really well. And John does a really nice job of kind of using some anecdotes of people that he interviewed to show how when you're in that situation, you can reflect on your life and be like, no, I've actually done really well, like, shut up. And it's another case of like, treat people as they can be, not as they are. So you can train your mind to reflect on those emotional signals and say, no, these are dumb. This is just like my genes trying to get me to breed or whatever.
Yeah, this is just evolution trying to make sure that I like go out and kill one more bear.
Yeah, like get one more mate or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's like, actually, I'm not in an environment where I need to go and kill one more bear. Yeah.
So with bringing it back to women, it might be the case that women's lib and all this sort of stuff gave women all these expectations about what they can achieve. And there was a flurry of books, I guess, 15 years ago or whatever, about the myth of having it all and how that's not really possible, and we've got to deal with all this other crap and stuff. So maybe there is an element there that life's not as good as they thought it would be, and that's why people aren't as happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's understandable, because I think there was this sense of like, maybe there's no such thing as a trade-off. Like, it had got to the point where, instead of it being like a kind of option thing where it's like, well, you can do whatever you want, it became instead like mandatory that you have to do everything. And like, that doesn't seem conducive to anyone's well-being at all. Yeah. But I think the expectation stuff is really compelling around there, and I'm really interested to hear about the measurement issues as well involved in that. But speaking of expectations and measurement issues, I know you have work around the impact of COVID lockdowns on people's well-being. And that's kind of also a controversial topic. So just in case I didn't have enough controversy inserted in, I thought I'd ask you one last question if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. I really like this paper because it shows that I can do empirical work and I'm not just here like poo-pooing.
That's what we wanted. You've got to do it. That's exactly right. You have to. I will only take criticism on empirical methods from people that have done them.
Yeah, if you do them. Yeah, I have. Yeah. Anyway, I try to do at least 1/5 of my work full empirical quant fat data sets.
Perfect.
So this is one of those. And I have to give a big shout out to my co-authors, Roberto Foa, who did almost all the analysis, and Sam Gilbert, who came up with the data set that we used. So we used 2 sets of data, both on mood. So we have very little life satisfaction data, which is one of the kind of sticky points for the methodology. We have YouGov's weekly poll of British people's mood, which is a very large, super beautifully representative sample of Brits, like more than 1,000 people every week. And they just get asked the battery of mood states, which is like the question I mentioned earlier. So yesterday, did you feel a lot of sadness, energy, enthusiasm, boredom, happiness, stress, anxiety, these kind of things?
Yes to all.
Yeah. And then in some waves, we have life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10, and it's the Cantrell's question, but it's the same thing. Anyway, and then we have Google Trends. And you might think Google Trends is a bit shit, but actually one of the main findings of the paper is that Google Trends are hot for this work. So because the YouGov data is really high quality, we can use it to test whether Google Trends actually track mood states as well as the YouGov data does. And they seem to have remarkably tight correlations. And we've since, so we had an original study where we used like 6 months of data, maybe something like that. And then now we've R&R'd it under some stringent reviewers. And we have a much longer sample, so we can show the out of sample properties, and they're really impressive. So actually the Google Trends, now we're working on trying to just establish an auto-updating database of Google Trends mood tracking for English-speaking countries that we'll just publicly make available. Like we'll just set up the API and it'll populate Excel spreadsheets for you, and you can just download it.
Awesome.
Anyway, so the question that we're trying to answer is, does the pandemic coincide with a decline in mood? And do lockdowns exacerbate or ameliorate whatever that effect is? So it's basically impossible to do causal analysis in this context because you don't have any counterfactual. So Sweden is not a counterfactual. A lot of people ask me that.
They still did have a pandemic in Sweden,
yes,
in fact.
They still did have a pandemic. They still kind of had lockdowns. It just wasn't like hard enforced. And yeah, you can't control a lot of the variables that you want to control. So there's essentially no counterfactual. And lockdowns are endogenous to the pandemic, which is that's the hard problem, really. So you can't tease those things apart. So all you can really talk about is prediction. Like if we have a pandemic, what would we predict mood to do? And if we then introduce a lockdown, what would we predict mood to do? And so the punchline is basically if we plot the time trend of mood for the UK, there's this very pronounced V shape, very pronounced, where mood tanks as the pandemic breaks out and deaths start rising. And there's not a lot of deaths yet. It's just deaths sort of kick off and everyone's terrified. And then basically like as soon as lockdown goes in, mood recovers massively. And there's a slight discrepancy, like the first, I think, 3 days of lockdown, things do seem to still be getting worse, and then they just recover very pronounced. Now, one issue is that people might just be adapting. There might be this homeostatic thing. We do find that there does seem to be about, I think it's a fifth of your mood from 2 weeks ago carries over to your mood today. So there does seem to be a fairly rapid adaptation, but we also find very significant results for the rate of deaths and things like that. So it seems the punchline is that lockdowns, in response to pandemic outbreak, seem to ameliorate people's mood. We then also find that when lockdowns are eased, there is an improvement in mood. So I think essentially what we're seeing is lockdowns ease the pandemic's negative effect on mood, but then have their own negative effect on moods. So there's a difficult policy question still, and unfortunately I can't just like kick at the people that are like, lockdowns are bad for well-being. I'm like, no, they're not. But like they are. It's just not clear that if you ease the lockdown, maybe it would improve the things that lockdown's bad for. But then if you just suddenly have a deaths explosion, then you're just back in bad moodville. So there is still just like a hard policy question here to address.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
For the future, policymakers should not fret about introducing a lockdown when there's a pandemic coming. It will not give people like quarantine terror or these things that people were very scared of at the start.
Got it. Cool. That's so fascinating. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us on ePODstemology.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rachel. Great hosting.
Fantastic. And tune in next time for more insights on social science, philosophy, and other intellectual curiosities.
You're listening to ePODstemology.
A quick thank you to all our listeners in 2021. I hope ePODstemology has been a tonic and a treat for you in this year of plague. ePODstemology will return in late January with episodes on migration, empathy, time use, and social technologies for unlearning capitalism. In the meantime, please catch up on our back catalogue, and if you'd like to buy me a Christmas present, I would be ever so grateful for reviews of the show on whatever podcast directory you use. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and all best wishes for the new year.